Hey, what's going on, folks? It's Mike here, and welcome to the next lesson in the D programming language series. In this lesson, we continue our journey learning about structs, this time talking about how to create them or initialize our structs. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the D language reference and see some different techniques for creating structs here. So I'm going to go ahead to the language reference. Let's go ahead to structs here. And where I'm going to be looking specifically here is under initialization here, and under the sections for structs here. So 3 different ways to initialize structs. Now I've already prepared an example, but I'll briefly just show you what I'm going to do, and then we'll see it in code and talk about it. So one of the ways that we can initialize structs, again, is just by, well, creating the struct here. And as you'll see, it can take on the default values. Okay, so that's one of the ways that we can do this by default. Now again, because everything's initialized to a default value in D, that helps us out quite a bit. But sometimes there might be specific reasons, as you'll see in this lesson, why we want to set some initial value. So if I scroll down here a little bit, you'll also see that we can do static initialization of structs, meaning that we can actually set the actual fields here. So if I have the variable A here, I can set it to 1, variable B, I can set it to B, and so on. And if I don't set the other values here when I'm initializing the struct, as you can see in these different instances of each of these structs here, well, then they'll just take on whatever the default value or the initialized value is already. So in this case, for an integer, C will just be 0 if I don't do anything with it, and the value D is set to 7 as shown in this example. And finally, the third example before we get into some code here is, of course, you can just initialize the struct here by setting it with some sort of function here. But this relates to something that we can get into in the next videos, which is going to be talking about struct constructors. So meaning some of the different things I can do is, well, just have a function that constructs it, some of the fields, perhaps here. I can make a copy from other structs. Those are some examples. But the other one that I want to show you here, and this is kind of a neat thing in the D programming language, is a struct literal, which is sort of like a constructor that you get for free. Okay, and that's to make something that looks like a function call. And as long as you don't have a constructor, which we haven't talked about yet in these series, so we'll get to that. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Then we can just actually place the parameters here, 1, which corresponds to X, and 2, which corresponds to Y in this example, and it'll work like a constructor initializing that construct to 1 and 2 here. All right, so let's go ahead and look at it in code here now that we've talked through some of these examples, and try with just a simple example. So here I've got a data structure here, maybe a math type, a vector 3, for instance, and I've got 3 floating point values, X, Y, and Z. Okay, and let's just go ahead and create one of these structs here, v0, and I'll print it out, which just prints out each of the fields here that I have. So let's go ahead and do our DMD and main here, and we get nan, nan, nan. Okay, so what is that here? Well, nan is actually the default value for a float. So let's go ahead and just verify that. So right line here, again, not forgetting some of the things that we've learned about in this series. And if I just print out, again, the initial value for a float, that property here, again, it is not a number here. Okay, so that's the default value for floats. And you might say, well, Mike, that's not very useful for me. Maybe I want these to be all 0 initialized, right? If I used integers, the default value for integers is 0, but I need floating point precision. So let's do something a little bit better. Okay, so I'll just set these values here to the non-default value, and I'll just say explicitly initialize fields here. And I'll set those to the floating point values 0.0 for each of them. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this and rerun it. And now you can see that we've got 0 across the board for our vector. Okay, so that's all set up here. Now, with this sort of initialization here, what we're going to learn here is I can also just set up this vec here by using, let me actually just show in the next example, some other technique here known as a struct literal, because maybe I don't want these to be 0, but I do want to set them to something else here. So of course my options are to just individually set vec0.x equals something and so on, but I can use a struct literal, which is kind of neat here, which will set x, y, and z to 1, 2, and 3. So the order that they're laid out in memory here is the order that I can initialize them. So let's go ahead and do that example here. I'll just call this v2. We'll print it out here. And you can see we have 1, 2, and 3. Okay. Now, again, what's kind of neat is if I only specify 1 and 2 here, and I run this, I get 1, 2, and then the z value here is 0. So again, in a way, I get these constructors, if you're coming from other languages, for free, right? A quick way to initialize and create these values. Now, one thing that I might not want to do here, though, with these structs is, what if I come in later and I'm doing a refactoring of this code, and I come in and I say, well, let's move float y here, and, you know, just by some copy paste error, I come in and say z equals, you know, 0.0f here. And then if I rerun this struct literal here, which let's go ahead and do here, and I run it, you'll notice the ordering's kind of weird. Maybe not what we expect, because it is following this order as things are laid out in memory in our structures. So a way to prevent that, one, is to probably be careful and logically lay out things. But the other thing that we can do here, if I show you the other way to initialize values here, is you can actually pass in the names, as we saw. So we could do x:1, y:2, z:3. And if I go ahead and run this, and let me go ahead and print this out. This one's v1 here. Then you'll see we get 1, 2, 3. And even if I, you know, change around the order of the variables here, I still get 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so that's just kind of a nice thing to do. I would probably encourage this style more so, but even more than this style of initialization, in the next lesson, I'm going to go ahead and teach you about constructors. Constructors are probably the preferred way to do things in the D language for setting up things. But on occasion, when I have these types here, like a vec3, I might just rely on either a struct literal, which again, I tend to get right by laying out x, y, and z, or one of these initializers here. Again, it just depends on the use case, but you should know these things exist. And I think what is important to know from this lesson is that you can explicitly just initialize the fields here by setting them. So that's probably also a good practice just to set those defaults. All right, we'll look at some other tips and tricks of things with constructors, delegating constructors, and so on later in this series. So make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss that. And if you want to track your progress, as always, check out my website here, courses.msha.io, to see the D programming language series. And that way you'll know where you left off in the series. And as always, folks, thanks for your time and attention. If you have comments, questions about how I did things here, or more things that you want to see, please let me know. And we're going to continue this discussion in the next lesson. So we'll see you there.